Hello, I'm Tom Harper.
And I'm Christopher Winn,
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show.
a podcast about the life and legacy of legendary adventure writer Wilbur Smith.
The plane had become a tiny black blob in the pale sky. I could still hear the distinctive drone of its engines, but with every breath the sound became fainter. I closed my eyes to focus my ears on the noise, but it was slowly and inevitably blotted out by the silence. When I opened my eyes again, the plane had gone. I was alone. I stood motionless for a second, breathing in the cold air. Even the smallest of movements sounded brutally intrusive in the stillness. The rasp of brittle fabrics, the polystyrene squeak of my boots in the snow. I turned on the spot, running my gaze slowly over the horizon, trying to take in my surroundings. After months of contemplating this place on the map, it seemed unreal that I was now physically here. To my right was the flat expanse of the Ross ice shelf, a featureless divide of white snow and blue sky, while to my left were the Transantarctic mountains, which extended in an unbroken line as far as I could see in either direction. The sun, still high in the sky, although it was almost midnight, bounced from the mountain sides of vibrant orange rock and turquoise ice. Each peak appeared intimately close by, even though I knew that I could travel for hours towards them and still not touch stone. I looked down at my hands, which were visibly trembling. My chest felt constricted, making it difficult to breathe, and my heart was running so fast that I could hear the thump of blood in my ears as clear as a drumbeat. An itch of adrenaline crawled along my arms to each fingertip and made the muscles in my legs quiver. My eyes rested on the mountains snaking off into the distance, and I was struck with sudden understanding. I knew exactly what was wrong with me. This was what it feels like to be terrified. This was a physical response to the horror I felt at being so alone. Every fibre of my body was yelling at me that something was terribly, terribly wrong.
Now, that was from the prologue to Alone in Antarctica, an exhilarating account of becoming the first woman to cross Antarctica alone. And it was written by our special guest today, polar explorer Felicity Aston. Now, Tom and I thought what better way to introduce our new series of That Wilbur Smith Show than to talk to a real-life adventurer and hero. Someone, indeed, who might have stepped out of the very pages of a Wilbur Smith adventure novel. And they don't come much more adventurous than our guest today, Felicity Aston. Felicity, welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show.
Hello, thank you very much.
Okay, now before we start, I think the listener should know that you are coming to us from the land of geysers and volcanoes and lava flows, the beautiful land that is Iceland. And I understand you had something of an adventure just getting home to do this podcast. And of course, you live some of the time in Iceland. Is that right?
I do. I live in the far northwest of Iceland. So the current eruption is happening at the opposite side of the country to where I am. So my failure to get home was nothing to do with the eruption, but just the Icelandic weather. It was my own fault. I planned to fly a domestic flight from Reykjavik, the capital, to where I live in the middle of an Icelandic winter. So when you book a flight in winter in Iceland, you always know it's sort of a 50-50 chance, or probably not even 50-50, 60-40 chance, not in my favor, of the flight actually happening. And so it didn't happen, and then there was a technical fault with the plane, so once we got in the air we had to come back again, so it was all rather exciting for half an hour, and then I decided to drive across country. It takes about 6 hours to drive from the capital to where I am, but the drive isn't a nice one. It's in and out of fjords where it's, there's no barrier at the side of the road, just a steep drop down into a very deep fjord. So I didn't relish the thought of making the journey, but here I am. I'm now home and I'm safe, and there's a storm outside, but I'm nice and warm inside, so it's all good.
Wow, for you, even getting home is an adventure. And in fact, it's only the latest of the many adventurous things you've done in your life. because as well as being the first woman to ski across Antarctica alone, I think only the third person ever. Is that right?
Yes, I forget now. There's been some people that have made crossings since, or partial crossings, and bits and pieces.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure what the current situation is with people having officially or non-officially crossed Antarctica. But I was certainly the first woman to do it alone. And there were, yes, I think there were 3 other Norwegians, all men that had made crossings before me. Actually, it was 2, Runa Gjeldnes and Paul Gausland.
Yes, I think it says on your website 2 Norwegians were the first.
Yes, yeah.
I think you were the third.
Fact checking myself on my own website. Yeah, I forget.
Yeah. We'll keep you straight. Yes, but as well as that, you've raced in the Canadian Arctic, led the first British women's crossing of Greenland, driven 36,000 kilometers across Eurasia to the pole of cold, which sounds like a very cold place indeed, the coldest inhabited place in the world. Retraced the route of the 1898 Klondike Gold Rush across the Yukon, led record-making international teams of novices to the North and South Poles, worked on a nuclear-powered icebreaker at the North Pole, flown in an airship across America, completed at the infamous Marathon des Sables across the Moroccan Sahara Desert, just for a change of climate, and spent 3 years living and working in the Antarctic. And somewhere in there, you've also found time to write 5 books. So, yeah, good luck keeping up with Felicity Aston. But we're very lucky to be catching up with you today. So I think I actually wanted to start with the Pole of Cold. What is that and where is it?
Yeah, so the Pole of Cold is the coldest inhabited place in the world. So the coldest recorded temperatures on planet Earth have been in Antarctica in the wintertime. But I heard about this place that has the coldest recorded temperature of somewhere where people actually live. And so that fascinated me, because I've spent a lifetime going to very cold places where nobody lives there. You know, that you have to go there, you take specialist equipment, you do years of planning, specialist logistics. And yet there was this place where temperatures had gone down to minus 70, below minus 70 degrees centigrade. And yet there was a place there where people went to work, people went to school, had families. And so I was fascinated. But, when I asked people, where do you think the coldest inhabited place in the world is? People said maybe Greenland, maybe Arctic Canada. It took a while before they guessed the right answer, which was northeast Siberia. And it's a tiny village called Omyakon, which has a kind of long-running feud with its neighbouring, slightly larger village of Yansk. And they sort of argue about who actually has the coldest temperature. But officially, it's this tiny village of Omyakon. There's probably only 200 or 300 people that live there. And so we travelled right the way from London, across sort of Arctic Scandinavia, right the way across Siberia, all the way to the Pole of Cold, trying to find out about people's lives in these most extreme environments and really what their attitude to winter was. Because obviously I'm a native of the UK, and our attitude of winter is usually to grimace and go, ugh, we don't look forward to it. And we think it's a time of year where everything becomes harder. And yet what we found on that journey was that people have very different attitudes. So in Omyakon, for example, winter is a time when everybody travels because all the ground freezes up, all the rivers freeze, and it's easier to travel on frozen rivers than it is to try and travel across land in summertime when all the ground is really marshy. It's permafrost in summertime, and so you instantly got this really different point of view. And then up in the top of Finland, I remember talking about winter as the dark time, and I got told, no, winter isn't the dark time. Winter is a time of color because you have northern lights, you have this sort of permanent twilight because there's no daylight, the sun barely makes it above the horizon, if at all. And so people told me the dark time is autumn before the snow falls, because then you don't get the reflection of the snow in the starlight and the moonlight. So it was such an eye-opening experience to make that journey and speak to people who live in these really extraordinary places.
Wow, minus 70 degrees. I can't even conceive of that, or how anyone could live in that sort of cold. Although it does sound sort of beautiful with the stars and the moonlight. But going back to the extract that Tom read out at the beginning, actually reads very much like a scene from one of Wilbur's books. And obviously you've got a great inquisitiveness and zest for life. I mean, your whole life seems to have been one adventure after another. Were you always so adventurous? I mean, did you always want to do things like travel to the Arctic and the South Pole or the coldest place on Earth?
I've always been curious about everything. So whenever I was offered an opportunity as a child to try something, be it rock climbing or sailing or, whatever the opportunity was, I was always curious enough to want to find out, what is that like? Would I enjoy it? Would I be good at it? Would I hate it? And with maps, the same thing. Whenever I've looked at maps of the world, my attention is always drawn to the fringes, to the edges, that names I don't recognize. And I want to know, well, what's there? What's it like to be there? Who else lives there? What are their lives like? And that's been a real driver in terms of me then wanting to go to a lot of these places. Same with the polar regions. I grew up, like a lot of people, with stories of Scott and Shackleton and all those explorers of the early 20th century. And my mind instantly went to the question, well, what does it feel like to have that experience? And what would my response to that experience be? Would I behave in the same way? Would I behave differently? What would my perspective be? So it's definitely that curiosity that has been a thread running through, and a driver that has run through all of those expeditions and experiences.
It's really interesting you say that, because I have exactly the same reaction to a lot of those stories. I think, how would I react and what would my experience be? But as a novelist, my way of working that out is by writing a novel about it. Whereas you've taken a rather more hands-on approach of actually going there and finding out firsthand. So I'm full of admiration. I mean, is this? But you've obviously done the Sahara Marathon, which we want to get to in a little bit. But I mean, cold does seem to be a theme with you. Is there something about snow or ice or cold that particularly captures your imagination? Do you know where that comes from, or is it just from having heard these stories from an early age?
I feel now more at home, more comfortable in the cold environment, and that worries me slightly. And that's why I've regularly gone to environments that I'm not so familiar with, because I need to remember, particularly because a lot of what I do is taking novices into the polar environment. I need to remind myself what it feels like when you don't know what to expect, when you're not familiar with what's on the horizon, what that feels like. And for my own curiosity as well, I think, for our own mental agility and well-being, there's so much benefit to be had from challenging yourself. And if somewhere feels like home, if somewhere feels very familiar, and before you set out that you're going to be capable in that environment, then that's not really a challenge, is it? So, and my curiosity, I would love to, now I've reached that certain point in my career where most often when people get in touch with me to say, to invite me on journeys or trips or whatever, they're inviting me to the polar regions. And I do say occasionally, I wish someone would invite me to French Polynesia occasionally, or the Galapagos, or, I'd quite like to explore some different environments. I guess that's the trouble with becoming a specialist in one particular environment. But as to why the cold environment has always spoken to me, it's quite a difficult question to answer. It's like, why do you prefer milk or dark chocolate? Where has that come from? And so I've thought long and hard about where this could possibly have come from. And I wonder if growing up in Southeast England, which is not extreme in any respect whatsoever, there aren't any big mountains, there aren't any big wilderness areas, there isn't extreme weather. But in those rare moments when we did have cold spells and snow, everything that I knew was transformed into something different. And it was a huge, exciting adventure. You'd get days off school and you'd go sledging or, exploring woodland that looked so different when it was all coated in snow and ice. So I wonder if there was a sort of nascent connection between the cold environment, snow and ice, and adventure, excitement, something different, discovery and exploration. But then I also think I can't underestimate how deep in the British psyche, particularly, stories of going to the polar regions to sort of prove yourself, find out what you're made of, your moral fibre, all that sort of thing. I think some of that must have seeped in to my psyche, whether I like it or not, because there was this sort of fascination with Antarctica that led me to deliberately seek out opportunities to go there and find out what it was like for myself. I do try and shake myself up a bit on a regular basis.
Crikey, I have to say my idea of shaking myself up is to go without a second slice of cake for tea rather than go off to the North Pole or the Antarctic. But, maybe that's just me. Anyway, there's a wonderful scene in the introduction to another of your terrific books, Life Lessons from Explorers, in which you describe being trapped alone on a glacier and with the wind being so ferocious that you couldn't even pitch your tent. Now, an experience like that, when you're all alone, must be really very frightening. I mean, how do you deal with the fear and the loneliness in a situation like that?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure I really ever discovered a proper answer. I often get asked in terms of how did you conquer your fear? How did you? And I don't think I ever did. I was a different level of scared every moment of every day. It was just a matter of trying to manage the fear to a point where I could continue in spite of it, rather than it never went away. And same with the isolation and the loneliness. People respond to that in different ways. And I think, it's interesting now, post-COVID, where we've now all had an experience of a certain amount of isolation. And now I see that there's a difference in the way people respond to my stories when I'm describing being alone in Antarctica. People have a lot more resonance with it than we did before COVID, because everyone experienced an element of isolation and loneliness and got to feel for themselves, how terrifying it can be when suddenly, there's no one coming over that horizon to help you. You've got to get yourself out of whatever trouble that it is that you've got yourself into. And that sort of element of self-reliance. And it made me realize just how, as a species, we humans, we're designed in our DNA to be tribal, social animals. And when you have a disconnect of any proportion with your tribe, with your people, that can affect you in all sorts of extraordinary ways. So I had a range of coping strategies, and they didn't change the same. They didn't stay the same throughout the whole journey. So for example, in the first seconds, when the plane first left me on the coast of Antarctica, I instantly started talking aloud to myself, just a running commentary on whatever I was doing. It was to fill the silence, to sort of subdue that feeling of isolation, I suppose. But then by the end of the expedition, I would go whole days without a single thought passing through my head. It was like an extreme form of meditation. I would hear my breathing. I would hear the blood in my ears. I would hear the wind, the white noise of the environment around me. And that was it, and that I found more terrifying, the fact that my brain could be that empty for that long. That kind of scared me.
Yeah, that's amazing. Chris mentioned your book about life lessons from explorers, which, as he said, is a great little book. Was there a favorite of yours, a favorite explorer that you wrote about, or one that you felt a particular kinship with? And I'm curious, of all the life lessons that you kind of adduced from them, was there one that particularly stuck with you?
Yes, I was so grateful for the opportunity to write that book. So the publisher got in touch and said, we'd like you to write this book for us. And they came with a list of 15 explorers that they wanted me to write about. And I said, well, if I'm going to write this book, I want to choose who I write about. And in the end, we agreed that that I could choose half of them. So I'll leave it to you to guess which half I chose and which half. But actually, I was also very appreciative of that scenario, because some of the explorers in that book were people whose story I thought I knew. So take Neil Armstrong, for example. I thought I knew that story. I thought I knew that man, that character. But then when researching for that book, reading about his life in quite some detail and reading about him, trying to get a sense of who he was, what an extraordinary human being he was. I had no idea of the sort of inspirational character that he was, and the strength of his values and integrity were astounding, particularly considering the experiences that he had in his life and the things he took on. So I was really grateful for the opportunity to learn more about those people I thought I knew, as well as the opportunity to spend time learning about my favorite explorers. And one of them, it's no accident I'm here in northwest Iceland, and so one of my favorite explorers from history is a woman called Guðríður. Guðríður, the far traveled, she's known in Iceland, in Icelandic, and she was a woman who lived in 800 900 AD. And she's written about in a lot of the sagas. That's why we know her story. But a lot of the places, so the farm that she built and the places where she lived, still exist today in Iceland. Nothing changes much here. So you can still go and see. So she's very much a real character, even though she lived so long ago. And she was one of the first Europeans to go to North America. And my understanding was that she was sort of a wife that was taken along. But then when I read more about her story, no, she was an instigator of these expeditions. She bankrolled it. In Viking society, women could inherit property from their husbands, their fathers. She'd been widowed twice already. Her father had died, so she owned the ships. And, she was the one that said to this man that wanted to marry her for her ships, right, well, okay, I'll marry you. You can have my ships, but this is what we're going to do with them, and this is where we're going to go. And she got to keep a lot of the proceeds from those journeys. So, I think the reason I love her character so much and her story is because I'm very aware that women have always been explorers. They've always been generals, leaders. This idea of women being sort of genteel and not bloodthirsty or not curious and explorers is a very recent idea in human history. And I think that the problem is that we really need to know more of these stories about these women that lived long ago, these trailblazers. I'm often called a trailblazer, but I don't feel like a trailblazer for women, because women have been doing this kind of thing and far greater things, for centuries, since the beginning of time. Of course they have. So that's why I think it's important that particularly these stories of women explorers, the next generation of women and the current generations of women need to know these stories.
Well, anyone listening to you on this podcast, Felicity, is certainly learning about trailblazers. I must say, Guðríður, Guðríður, is that how you say it? Guðríður is not someone I've come across before, but she sounds quite remarkable, a real hero. And I've always actually been fascinated in stories about the New World and who got there first. Was it the Welsh or the Vikings? But maybe it was Guðríður and got there before any of them. But as we're talking about trailblazers and strong women characters, Tom and I first met you, Felicity, at the Royal Geographical Society in London, where you were judge for the Wilbur and Niso Smith Foundation Adventure Writing Awards. And the book you chose as the winner that night was a wonderful novel set in the Australian outback called No Country for Girls by Emma Stiles. And that featured 2 strong female characters. But I was wondering, considering your own life has been an adventure from beginning to end, what were you looking for in a good adventure story?
Yeah, I was looking for a sense of place, firstly. I want to be transported to wherever the book is taking me, and I want to feel like I've really experienced that environment and been there with the characters, living through the moments with them, so that I could get that same excitement, that thrill of adrenaline by reading that story as I would if I was actually on that adventure and taking part in it. And it was funny in the judging process when the panel of judges got together to discuss the short list of books and to try and decide on our winner. A big topic of conversation was, well, what is an adventure? What makes a story an adventure? And we decided on a few things. We decided that it needed to be a journey, first off, that an adventure to us was a journey, be that metaphysical or physical, and that it needed to have that element of excitement in it, and also that the sense of place was really important as the characters.
And certainly the book that you chose, No Country for Girls, so has that tremendous sense of place, in this case, the Australian outback.
Yeah, the sense of place was really important. It's set in the Australian outback, and my goodness, I feel like I have been there because I could feel the heat. I could, I had the grit in my nostrils and in between my teeth, and then the story itself, it was couldn't put it down, thriller minute adventure from beginning to end.
In the best tradition of a Wilbur Smith novel, of course, and a cracking adventure story, and full of strong, interesting characters.
Yes, I mean, the first thing I liked about the book actually was the characters. When the two main protagonists were introduced in the book, I mean, I think when the second character, Naomi, was introduced, I might have cheered out loud because she was such a real person. She was a woman, but she presented as being slightly overweight and unfit. She's trying to run away from the bad guys, and is wishing that she'd done a bit more running, and I'm that speaks to me as well. I thought, you are a real person. You are someone that I can imagine in my head, and but she's clever and intelligent, and she's not brave the whole time. Sometimes she's really scared, and again, that spoke to me because I'm fed up of seeing particularly female heroes presented where they show no fear and they always look perfect and they've got everything under control, and you just think, well, this just isn't realistic. Who is like that in real life? And I think it gives everybody sort of unrealistic expectations to try and live up to. So it was wonderful that her characters were unapologetically individuals that had their own backstory and their own reasons for being the way that they were.
It's interesting talking about the kind of the characters being these very believable women, and getting away from this idealized version of the kind of superheroine who's absolutely cool in every situation. Because of course, one of the things you've done is you've taken groups of inexperienced women from all over the world to the poles. Presumably, this is with a similar kind of intent to actually demystify the process and show what women are capable of.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the expeditions where I've put together teams of international women to ski to the South Pole and to the North Pole, it was a deliberate attempt to create a team of people that looked the least like the image that maybe pops into your head when you hear the word polar explorer. I think even today, most people, the image that pops into their head would be a 6-foot bearded Norwegian man, that sort of thing.
With icicles hanging off his moustaches.
Exactly. And I wanted to sort of debunk that myth. There are a lot of women doing amazing things in the polar arena right now, and yet it's still perceived as a male-dominated area. And yet, it was only a few seasons ago where there were more women going out to do solo expeditions to the South Pole than there were men. Wow. So it's not necessarily true. So, I had teams of women from all sorts of places, like Ghana in West Africa, Jamaica in the Caribbean, Brunei Darussalam on the island of Borneo. And so, I had 5 foot tall, very petite Asian ladies on my team, as well as people from all around the world. And so it was a deliberate attempt to say, to everybody, including the women themselves, is that you are capable of far much more than you could ever imagine. You just need to give yourself the opportunity to prove that to yourselves, that to see how much you're capable of, mentally and physically. And those have been incredible experiences to be part of, because I've seen firsthand people overcoming their own self-doubt, their own insecurities. And it changes from me telling people you can do this in a sort of coaching role to watching people go out and telling themselves, I can do this. And then they go out and totally smash it. And it's wonderful to see that, that switch, that development in people. And, it's something that I have to remind myself of too. I'm not immune to going out and doing something. And as soon as you hit an obstacle, those insecurities and self-doubt are loud in your head. It's the first thing that rises to the surface. And I don't think it matters how often you do this sort of thing. It's still an effort to calm those voices and to get on with it, in spite of them.
Wow, it must take a great strength of mind to overcome those voices, but I'm not sure that I could. But anyway, we've been talking about a sense of place and the importance of a sense of place. And Wilbur is superb at that, of course. I mean, he really takes you there and makes you want to go there, to experience the sights and the sounds and the smells for yourself. But now it seems to me that the North Pole and the South Pole can't really have much of a sense of place, can they? I mean, they're just cold and white. What do you actually experience when you're at the North Pole or the South Pole? Are they very different?
That is an amazing question, because I'm often saying to people that the Arctic and the Antarctic are two completely different places that feel very different. To the point where I think if you dropped me in a cold place, blindfold, not knowing where I was, I could probably take a pretty good stab at telling you whether I was north or south. I mean, the look of the place is very different for a start, because the Arctic is mostly an ocean, the Arctic Ocean, so it's a frozen ocean, not a rock continent. So there's no sort of geography. And then even if you're in the Arctic region, on the northern land masses that surround the Arctic Ocean, it has a distinctive look to it. You're often quite mountainous, or it's very low lying, and the geography has a look to it. In Antarctica, it's a rock continent, but when you're in the central region, it's completely flat and there's no geography whatsoever. So you can walk 1,000 kilometers in any direction and still see the exact same view, just that flat white line dividing snow from sky in every direction. And even when you reach the edges of Antarctica and you start to get some geography, some mountain ranges, it's just the top of the mountain ranges that are usually visible, something we call nunataks. They look very different to the geography that you get in the north. But I think the biggest difference between the two of them is the life. So in the Arctic, it doesn't matter where you are surrounded by life. There's life in the water, even if it's got ice on top of it, even if it's a frozen ocean, there's life there. And there's Arctic foxes, and there's lemmings, and there's wolves, and there's reindeer, and there's polar bear. There's so much life. Whereas in the center of Antarctica, so this huge area that's twice the size of Australia, it's a vast area, the interior of Antarctica, and its one defining feature is the absence of life. This is a place where even bacteria has a hard time surviving. So you don't find bugs or flies or mosses or lichens. There is nothing. That's slightly different around the coast of Antarctica. That's where you start to get open water, and therefore you start to get wildlife. So there's penguins, there's seals, there's whales, but certainly when you're in the interior of Antarctica, there's an absence of life, and that makes a difference in the smell of the place. Antarctica, my defining smells of Antarctica, actually, the smells that when I experience them take me right back to Antarctica are sun cream and aviation fuel. Actually, those are the two things that take me back to Antarctica every time. But most of the time when you're in Antarctica, you just have this kind of clean ozone smell. The smell that you get when you open a box that contains some kind of technology, sort of like a fridge or a TV set or something like that. It's that kind of clean, industrial, sterile smell. And I remember when I was in Antarctica for 3 years without a break, so I was constantly in Antarctica for 3 years. When I first came out of Antarctica and got off in the Falklands, the thing that really struck me was the smell. You could smell life. I could smell grass and soil and, in that instance, penguin poo and all sorts of things. And the air felt thick. It felt thick with things. There were insects flying around. There were birds flying around. There were sort of feathers and dust and debris being blown about in the wind. And it was almost like I felt I had to duck to avoid things because the air just felt thick with life and material, whereas in Antarctica all of that is absent.
That's amazing. I've never heard it described that way before. That seems almost senses that we've sort of forgotten how to use in day-to-day life because they're so overloaded, and then you just get it heightened by not using it for a while.
Well, Antarctica is very good at that. When it takes away everything, it's like you have space suddenly to notice the details. So you notice the details of the weather changing. Your view of the sky is completely unobstructed, unlike many other places in the world. So, but other senses are heightened because your experience empties out of everything else. And it's one of the things I find hardest if I've been on expedition for a long period of time. Your life is very simple. It goes down to the basics of keeping alive, eating, moving, sleeping. It's basically down to those three things. And then you come back to normal life in inverted commas, and suddenly everything is so much more complicated. You don't have everything you need immediately around you. You have to go into another room, or you have to go to another building. You have to go shopping and get your things. They're not all immediately accessible. And then going to a supermarket. I remember the first time when I got back from Antarctica after being there for 3 years, I came back, went to a supermarket, needed some toothpaste, so many different choices of toothpaste, and it was just overwhelming. And I think I left with nothing because I just couldn't process it was so unfamiliar to me, this whole system of having to choose something, and it was too much. It was overload for me, but soon got over that.
Talking of toothpaste, how do you get your toothpaste and all your other supplies when you're living in Antarctica? I mean, presumably there's no Lidl or Tesco that you can just pop into. I mean, do planes fly everything in from time to time, or do things come by boat?
There are planes. There are also ships. So when I was stationed on a research base in Antarctica, there would be 2 ships, one at the beginning of a summer and one at the end of a summer, that would come in to bring all sorts of supplies, not just food, but supplies that were needed for the scientific experiments going on, and just everything that you need in order to survive, because it's impossible to be self-sustaining in Antarctica. Everything has to come from outside. But they can also be flown in too. So places like the South Pole Station, which is right in the middle of the continent, they have a skiway on the snow right outside the research building, and planes fly in with supplies rather than the ship.
My next question sort of ties in with that. As on one of your many adventures, you retraced the route across the Yukon of the Klondike Gold Rush of 1898. And I read somewhere that back in the day, the Canadian authorities made the prospectors carry enough food supplies for an entire year so that they weren't going to starve. And when you retraced their steps, did you have to do that too, as well as carrying all the equipment and things?
Yeah, so I retraced the route of the Klondike, the 1898 Klondike Gold Rush, as part of a BBC mini-series. So that was with Dan Snow. It was for BBC History, and so it was set up as a TV program rather than an expedition. So, for example, and you're right. I learned a lot about the history, and one of the things that was really gobsmacking about that journey was that halfway through this particular route that we were taking to the Klondike goldfields that were. Crosses from America into Canada, and the border crossing is right in a mountain pass, really high up, really hard to access. And that was the point at which anybody that wanted to cross the border had to prove that they had a year's worth of supplies. So it was stipulated how much food that had to be, but also what equipment you had to have with you. And quite literally, it added up to a ton of goods. So they had a ton of equipment. So there were a whole range of people that took part in the stampede. There were people that could afford to pay others to porter their stuff. But then there were others that were there that had no money. And so maybe they would work as a porter for a bit to build up the money to be able to go with their own ton of goods. So we didn't have to carry a ton of goods with us, although, we had a whole lot of stuff with us, but we didn't have a ton of goods. But then, that's just where the Stampeders' troubles began, really, because then as you come down from the mountain pass, you take to the rivers and you start to have to cross rapids. And we were given a pretty authentic period boat to run the first rapids in. And if you watch the program that resulted, then you'll know that it was an utter disaster. I mean, we ended up with Dan Snow almost breaking his nose as he got clobbered by the oar. And so he was sort of bleeding all over the boat. Me and Kevin, the other presenter in the show, ended up sort of stuck on our backs in the front of the boat, sort of helplessly waving our arms and legs around, trying to regain some balance. And after that, the production team quite rightly said, "Okay, you're not running any more rapids." So they sort of propelled us forwards. We still spent we went about 400 kilometers, I think, down the Yukon to get into Dawson and what were the Klondike goldfields, but they wouldn't let us run any more rapids, and they certainly wouldn't let us do it with a ton of goods, because the beach where we ended up, I remember sitting there as Dan was having his nose seen to and things, and I realized that the beach was covered in little bits of pottery and glass. And this was all debris from the original stampeders who had tried to get through these rapids with their ton of goods. And it had all ended up often in the death of the stampeders, but with all their goods and all their supplies being scattered up and down the riverbank, either before or after the rapids. So it was a real touch point with history when you realise, firsthand how difficult this journey was and what people were risking, and therefore the desperation in their lives that had motivated them to run those sort of risks and those sort of dangers. It was really quite incredible. It felt like a journey that was haunted by ghosts, actually, that particular expedition, because there were so many points on that journey where you really got insight into what those experiences of those people 100 years before must have been, and quite how terrifying and awful it was.
It is amazing. I think one of the themes you get often in Wilbur's writing is this sort of dialogue between the past and the present, because obviously these desert places, and I know that the Arctic is a desert, a different sort of desert, isn't it? And the Antarctic. And so you get things like Scott's Hut, which I think is still preserved almost as well as the day he left it in Antarctica. So I don't know, have you been there?
I have not. It's a bit of a bone of contention between me and my husband, actually, because we were both supposed to be on an expedition that was going to Scott's Hut, crossing Antarctica in vehicles and going to Scott's Hut. But I was 4 months pregnant with our first child, and he decided to go anyway. So he has been to Scott's Hut, and I stayed at home. We decided that it was an expedition I was going to sit out. So it's still a bone of contention between us that he has had that wonderful experience. But he did take lots of video and footage for me that I've seen since. And yes, it's a place that I hope one day in my life I get to see, because as you're saying, it's one of those places that really is inhabited by ghosts, where you get to smell the smell and really understand the stories in a way that the best adventure literature does. You know, this is where we're going full circle with this conversation, is that, you know, I think the best adventure books, and something that Wilbur's books do, is they transport you to these places and make you feel as if you have been there. And that's why I think it's so important, the work that the foundation does in providing travel grants for fiction authors to go and experience places for themselves. Because if they've been and smelled those smells and had those experiences firsthand, then that really bleeds through into the fiction, which is so important. You know, not everybody gets the opportunity to go to all these far-flung places, and yet there's things that are really important for us to learn as a society from all of these different places. And you know, you can be inspired to go yourself, or inspired to you know, take an action by reading fiction about a place and about an adventure. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, it's amazing how many people you meet in this line of work who have read a Wilbur book in particular, and that's inspired them to go to Africa or to have different adventures.
And that is extraordinary, particularly because they're never very complimentary descriptions.
Yes.
I mean, people regularly come a cropper, and you think you're talking to people about, you know, all the dangers and hazards of going to, and that for some reason sort of inspires them to go. I mean, it's a bit like in my own specialism, polar regions. You know, you hear about frostbite and people dying in really awful, gruesome, lingering, undesirable ways to go, and yet somehow that provides motivation and inspiration to experience that for yourself. I think it speaks to sort of how perverse we are as a species, really.
Yeah.
Deliberately seek these things out.
Losing all my toes, I'll have some of that. At the opposite extreme, for all these cold places we've been talking about, you did the, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but the Marathon des Sables in the Sahara Desert. I'm personally very fascinated with this because I've written in various books I've done loads of scenes of people crossing deserts without having actually crossed a desert myself. So I'm really curious as to your kind of first-hand experience of what is that like. Obviously, the difference with being incredibly hot and incredibly cold, and also if you have any practical tips for surviving the desert. That next time I have to write one of these scenes, we can work in.
Well, I mean, the desert was one of those experiences that I was mentioning earlier, in that, you know, it was an environment I really didn't know at all. So I was going there as the complete novice and relying on my research and speaking to people who had been to similar environments. And, you know, so it was a real refresher for me in what it feels like to be going truly into something that's completely unknown to you. And the big surprise for me was that the desert sometimes is not very hot.
Okay, yeah.
So when I first arrived in the desert, for the first couple of days, the problem was there was flash flooding going on. So it was torrential rain. We were having to dodge these huge torrential rivers that were springing up in the middle of nowhere in these flash floods, and we were freezing cold because we only had equipment preparing us for extreme heat, and suddenly we found ourselves absolutely drenched and pretty freezing at night. So that was the first sort of surprise that I learned. And then the other big unknown for me was the terrain itself. You know, we had the classic kind of desert sand dunes, but then the vast majority of what we were running over was gravel plains, where the gravel was sort of stones the size of your fist. And so trying to walk, never mind run, over that kind of terrain for long periods of time, and then going up and over jebels. So these are the sort of stacks of rock and tips of mountains and things that's scattered all over the desert. You know, it was trying to scale those was pretty incredible. And then running through the night in the desert. I remember one of my clearest memories is running along just with a lamp light. So you've got that sort of shaky spotlight ahead of you as you're running. And then I just suddenly, sort of all the hairs on the back of my neck went up, and I just felt that there was something next to me. And I sort of shined my head torch around to see, and it sort of caught eyes glowing, and there was a whole bank of eyes. It was like a streak of sparkling stars. And suddenly, I was sort of peering into the darkness, like, what on earth is that? And I realized it was a whole herd of camels. Oh, wow. And what we found was that the camels tended to gravitate towards people. So obviously there was an intermittent stream of runners going in one particular direction across the desert, and all the camels seemed to amass in the darkness around where we were running. But it was a real kind of shock, because I had no previous knowledge of the behavior of wildlife in the desert. And so it was a real voyage of discovery. But that was what made it so wonderful. And again, it was one of those things where you suffer physically and mentally. You suffer really hard every single moment of every single day. And yet at the end of it, the feeling of reward and triumph and overcoming adversity gives you this sense of euphoria and, really being in the moment of reality almost. It feels like those are the real moments when you're truly alive and you're truly living, to experience that kind of euphoria and reward, having seen something through. And the people that you have those experiences with, I mean, that race was very special for me because I ran it with my sister. And so we had that experience together. And I think you get to see real people, the rawness of people. And what is wonderful about that is that when everything is stripped away, when someone is tired, hungry, far from home, their feet are blooded and painful, and they are having to put everything that they are into every step to keep going, you get to see, the true strength of people. And what's really wonderful is that so much more often than not, what you see is utterly brilliant. You get to see why human beings are so wonderful. We are capable of ingenuity and compassion and, courage and bravery and so much wonderful stuff. And you really get to see that. And it's a reminder that, we human beings are pretty special. We're capable of, the opposite end of the spectrum too. But, we mustn't forget just how incredible we are as what we are capable when we're at our best.
Well, some of us are a bit more capable than others, perhaps. But I could go on listening to you all day, Felicity. But unfortunately, we're beginning to come to the end of our time. So maybe just a couple more questions. Do you have another question, Tom, that you'd like to ask?
Yeah, sure. I say, between a sister who runs Sahara marathons and a husband who does Antarctic expeditions, I'm beginning to get a sense of how tough it is to keep up with the Aston family. But so actually on that theme, I guess my question is, what next for you?
Well, at the moment, I'm preparing to head to the Arctic Ocean. So for the last 5 years, really, my focus has been very much north. And that's because our window of opportunity to be able to travel across the surface of the Arctic Ocean, particularly on foot and by ski, is rapidly dwindling. And as we stand here today, the last time I went to the North Pole in 2018 with a team is the last time anyone was able to ski to the North Pole. So no one's been able to get to the North Pole since, not over the surface, the frozen surface.
I mean, I knew it was bad, but I had no idea that it's literally been inaccessible for that long.
Yes. And I mean, the last time somebody skied from land to the North Pole happened in 2014, and it's largely accepted that that's never going to be possible again. So we've already gone from the first to the last. And what's really shocking about that is that the first person who undisputedly reached the North Pole by crossing the surface of the Arctic Ocean was Sir Wally Herbert back in 1969. So, in the space of 50 years, we've gone from the first to the last. And I think while people may not care that explorers can't plant their flag at the North Pole anymore, I think the importance of that story is to really highlight how rapid these changes have been. Icebergs and glaciers falling into the sea, that's all a natural process. What is not natural is the speed at which this change is happening. And at the same time, I'm acutely aware that there's still so much we don't know about this Arctic environment. There's still some really quite basic questions about sea ice in particular that we don't have the answers to. And so, time is really running out to gather information before we lose this environment for good. So I'm going back up to the last 5 years, I've been doing expeditions all the way around the Arctic, collecting snow and ice samples and collecting other data to try and fill in some of these data gaps. And in April, we're hoping to get up to an area called Nunavut in Arctic Canada to cross a marginal sea of the Arctic Ocean to collect snow and ice samples. So we're just gearing up for that at the moment. But that's been the mission. It's called Big North Pole. If you'd like to follow how we get on, you can find us online. And, it will be among the last expeditions to be able to get out and do this kind of journey in this way.
Wow. That is a sobering note to end on. But a reminder that, as we also get from all those books, actually, that so many of these really archetypal environments that capture our imaginations from a young age, whether it's the sort of African savannas teeming with wildlife and all these animals which are now endangered, or whether it's the poles where you've worked, that, as you say, we can go from the first to the last very quickly, and they are all subject to these tremendous changes. And of course, conservation was a subject that was absolutely very, very close to Wilbur's heart. And he did a lot of work in Africa around that.
Well, exactly. I mean, we've talked about, the heroic age of exploration where it was all about conquering an environment. I think what we've seen in the last recent decades is that now exploration is not about conquering places. It's not about discovering places and drawing maps anymore. It's about understanding those environments. And it's pretty incredible when you think about somewhere like the Arctic or the Antarctic, particularly the Antarctic. This is an environment that human beings are not designed to survive. And yet not only are we surviving it, but we're understanding it. We're understanding how long it's been there, how it's changed, how it will change in the future, what we can do to preserve the wildlife that's there, and what we can do to lessen our impact on that place. So I think adventure literature has a huge role to play in all of that, because it inspires people not just to go out and explore and draw maps, but it inspires people to understand, to experience and understand an environment and to understand its value to the world as a whole. And, that's what we need more of in the century to come, is that we need people who don't just want to go and have an adventure for an adventure's sake, but want to have an adventure in the process of understanding and making things better. And that's never been more important than now, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I think what I take from your story is that although, as you say, the heroic age of exploration as conquest may be over, the work we do now is maybe even more important, and certainly from your life, no less adventurous. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing those stories with us. It's been wonderful having you on the programme.
Yes, thank you so much, Felicity. You've really made those extraordinary places and adventures come alive.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
So thank you very much indeed. And thank you for sparing the time between all your adventures to come on that Wilbur Smith Show.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Tom, I really don't think we could have found ourselves a better or a more adventurous guest for the first episode of our new series than Felicity Aston.
I feel that she has brought the adventure well and truly. I think one of the things that most interested me in what she said was how much stories influenced both what she had done, why she had done what she did, and also then as she went on doing it. And she talked about the stories both of real life adventurers and also fictitious ones who'd inspired her to be this incredibly adventurous person, but also the stories that she tells about particularly about what women are capable of, in terms of inspiring another generation. So although we're in a very different environment to the sort of classic world of Wilbur Smith, storytelling is very much at the heart of what she does and who she is.
And of course, she does have some incredible stories to tell.
Yeah. No, it's of course. She's also, as well as being very modest and an incredibly accomplished explorer, she's also a great writer, as listeners will have heard from the excerpt I read from Alone in Antarctica. And I do encourage people to read her books, because certainly as a thriller writer who's spent a long time trying to conjure up these other places, because we talked about sense of place being so important in any book. I did feel a certain professional envy at the skill and with which she described that landscape and herself and her own feelings in it, and the way it absolutely came alive. And you were there on the edge of Antarctica, alone in the wilderness, as she as put you in her shoes. Phenomenal writer.
You can find out about Felicity and her adventures and her books at her website, felicityaston.co.uk. That's Felicity Aston, all one word, all small letters, .co.uk. Now, in the next episode, coming out in 2 weeks' time on Friday, March 22nd, we will be reviewing some of the highlights of our last series and looking forward to what's coming up in the new series.
So if you want more adventures, do tune in to our next episode. But until then, it's goodbye from me, Tom Harper.
And it's goodbye from me, Christopher Winn. That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Winn. Music by Dewey DeLay. Executive producer, Niso Smith.